think it's incumbent upon everyone to not view this in terms of ideology or politics, but to view this as a basic question of what America stands for. And one of the things we stand for is the right to speak freely. And the First Amendment is first for a reason. And I think we need to really kind of get back in the habit of not thinking about this as an issue where we want to protect voices we agree with. It's about protecting all voices, regardless of whether you disagree with them or not.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're reminded that a week in politics is a really long time, especially under the current administration. Trump has spent years demonizing the press, popularizing the concept of fake news, and calling journalists the enemy of the people. But journalists are only one of the groups whose freedoms, guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, have been blatantly transgressed by Trump. His list of offences grows by the hour. Trump's flagrant disregard for law and order has manifested itself in the deportation or imprisonment of immigrants, foreign students, and even random tourists to detainment facilities out of state. Those who oppose him are liable to become the next subject of attack, and this includes lawyers who have challenged his actions in court. Trump also views academic centres of learning as a threat because they encourage independent and critical thinking, not anti-Semitism, which is the catch-all used for his attacks. His assault on books and education and what constitutes historical facts has now morphed to include institutions like the Smithsonian, the world's largest museum network, with plans to eliminate, quote, improper, divisive, or anti-American ideology. So, today's forum on Demonizing the Truth aims to take stock of our current predicament and to consider how far Americans are willing to go to safeguard their rights, which are being chiseled away day by day. This means, of course, the free press, our schools, our equity and access to lawyers, our rights to protest, preserving our access to history and to the truth. Well, we have three wonderful speakers today who have given off their time and expertise to speak to this important topic. This should add to our understanding. First, David Enrich is the business investigations editor for the New York Times. He's written a book, Murder the Truth: Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. Berna León is a visiting fellow at Harvard, where he teaches political theory. He recently wrote a compelling op-ed in The Guardian. Finally, we have Jesse Hagopian, I'm sure that's wrong, Hagopian, who is joining us from Seattle, where he's an educator and director of the Zinn Education Project's Teaching for Black Lives campaign. He's also author of the book, Teach Truth: The Struggle for Anti-Racist Education. Well, welcome to all three. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Well, just to test you, audience out there, we're going to throw up the Bill of Rights amendments so you can actually see how many of them have already been transgressed. So while we're looking at that, we'll start with you, David. Trump's attack list has blown up to include not just the media, but activists, immigrants, and others. As a journalist, you're in the front line, and your book meticulously details how many of the seeds for this situation were already sown in the first term. Can you give us a bit of a brief background as to how we've reached this predicament now with the war on the press?
Yeah, well, this has been a years-long project of Donald Trump's, I think, to really chip away at the credibility and trustworthiness of the media and really to weaken the media as a check on power. And, it started 8 or 9 years ago when Trump was first campaigning for president, where he took up this time-honored tradition among politicians of both parties, which is bashing the media. And Trump, as has been his wont to do basically forever, took things a lot farther than his predecessors had and started really demonizing the media, often in very incendiary and at times personal ways. And it kind of went from there. And he started calling for the curtailment of various press freedoms in his first administration. But it really kind of took flight, I think, a lot more during the interregnum between his two terms, where he resumed his campaign of filing lawsuits against news outlets and journalists whom he didn't like or that had been critical of him. And it has really ratcheted up even further in the past 2 or 3 months with a mix of lawsuits and investigations by his administration and other punitive actions that the administration has been taking. But this has become not just something that Trump does, but his rhetoric and actions and policy preferences have really they've taken hold in among a much broader swath of people than they previously had. And it's become one of the kind of leading goals of the conservative legal movement to reverse decades old Supreme Court precedents that protect the right of journalists and others, just members of the public, to speak and fearlessly and truthfully about public figures and public officials. And I think that a lot of the legal threats that we've been seeing in really over the past 5 or 10 years from Trump and his allies are designed to serve a very specific purpose, which is create an environment where the perceived costs of speaking up against powerful people with whom you have a disagreement or that you want to hold to account, the perceived costs of doing that are higher than they ever have been. And that's because you are much more likely to get sued. You are much more likely to face various investigations. And for an administration that is often, but not always, but often using lies or conspiracy theories or distortions to promote its agenda, discrediting the media and kind of shackling the media and weakening the media, I think is a very tactful and understandable decision, because having a credible, powerful, independent media that refutes lies and distortions is obviously a threat to an administration that wants to use those arguments to promote its agenda.
So some of the major outlets have already kind of caved in, some in advance of threatened lawsuits, like Disney and CBS. So usually this is based on the fact that Trump didn't like the coverage, as though their job was to inflate or promote his image. So this is a travesty for a democracy, right? If this happens, we're going to have like a press outlet that's PR for Trump, rather like Pravda operates for Putin.
Well, I think there's no question that Trump would prefer to have a press corps that just routinely praises him and hails him as the wonderful leader that he thinks he is. In fairness, I don't think that that's a new phenomenon among American leaders or probably leaders from any country. And obviously, having an aggressive, independent, vigorous media calling balls and strikes is something that has pissed off many an administration, probably going back to America's founding. I'm not sure I agree with the characterization that a lot of media outlets are already kind of caving into those demands. There's been one really clear example of that, which is ABC News settling a lawsuit that Trump had filed against them. There's been talk of CBS News possibly settling a lawsuit, but that has not happened yet. And to me, the real question here, and what we have not seen, which I think is really important, is while we've seen a lot of litigation and a lot of saber rattling and the beginning of the Trump administration actually using its power to investigate and perhaps punish news outlets, what we have not yet seen, at least from my perspective and based on what my reporting shows, we have not yet seen any sort of kind of mass effort or mass movement by mainstream journalists and news organizations to start pulling their punches and self-censor. And I have no doubt that that is the goal, one of the goals of the Trump administration in its war on the media. And I'm definitely not going to say that that will not happen. But from where I sit, that has not happened yet. And I think that's a really important distinction.
Well, it's happened a bit with the Washington Post, hasn't it?
Well, I think it depends how you view that. I mean, the Washington Post's editorial page has certainly shifted much more in line and much more kind of in lockstep with a view that is closer, although not entirely consistent with what Trump wants. I mean, it's been very anti-tariff, for example. But and to me, I'm a reporter And to me, the thing that matters most, it's not surprising or particularly unusual for an opinion page to hew to the whims or ideology of its owner. And that's Jeff Bezos's prerogative. What has not happened yet, to my knowledge, is any sign of the news side of the Washington Post pulling punches or self-censoring. And in fact, I think that despite them being under intense fire from a lot of people, including many on the left, they've done a really admirable job of continuing to just report the unvarnished truth and do their best to hold Trump and others to account. And that's not easy to do when you are getting signals from your publisher and from the White House and from the public writ large that it's canceling subscriptions. And I think it's actually a testament to the courage and steadfastness of the Washington Post's reporters and editors on the news side that they've been able to withstand that pressure.
We've got a couple of questions have already come in about this now. The fear that the Supreme Court will side with those who sue the media seems to be the real problem. Are lawsuits against the executive orders the place to go?
Well, I think there's a bunch of different, that's kind of conflating a few things. And there's a years-long conservative campaign led by Trump, but involving many other people and many other interest groups on the right that's trying to overturn Supreme Court precedents like New York Times versus Sullivan. And that's kind of one of the central subjects of my book. And that is definitely part of a broad effort by powerful people, whether people in the White House or just powerful businesses or leaders in local communities across the country that are really trying to weaponize laws in general and defamation and libel laws in particular to muzzle the media and to punish members of the public who speak out. And I think that the executive orders that Trump has issued, at least thus far, are not targeting news organizations. They've been targeting, among others, big law firms and institutions like that. And some of those law firms have reached agreements with the Trump White House. Others have sued in many cases successfully, sued to block the implementation of those executive orders. And so by some measure, at least those lawsuits have been successful. I think that one of the challenges, we'll see if we have to cross this bridge, but the one exception to what I said is with the Associated Press, which has the Trump administration blocked its reporters from covering certain events at the White House because the AP refused to start calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. And the AP sued to reinstate its access. A judge ruled in the AP's favor. The Trump administration thus far appears to have not adhered, at least strictly, to that court's interpretation of things. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on right now that we do not know the role that the courts are going to continue to be able to play in this. And I think it's kind of a very unnerving and frankly, like probably unprecedented situation in this country. And so I don't quite know how it's going to unfold, but it's definitely something that journalists and media executives and media lawyers are paying a whole lot of attention to right now.
Okay, you alluded to a very important case, which maybe our audience don't know about, but it's big in the book, which is the jeopardy the free press face right now because of the challenge to the Times versus Sullivan judgment. Can you fill us in on what that means and what has changed in terms of the public eye?
Yeah, so I mean, without going into all the really interesting details about that case's history, the bottom line is that this is a 1964 decision that was made unanimously by the court that said when you are writing about public figures or public officials, or if you're a public figure or a public official and you believe you've been defamed by a journalist or someone else, in order to win that case, you need to not only prove that your reputation was damaged by falsehoods. You also need to prove that the writer or speaker or publisher spoke those defamatory falsehoods, either knowing that what they were saying was false, so in other words, they were lying, or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. And the Supreme Court created this high bar deliberately. And the reason was that in a country that values free speech and wants the public to be able to investigate and criticize and debate matters of public importance, people need to have the breathing room so that if they make an honest mistake or a good faith error as they're criticizing someone, they don't run the risk of being sued into oblivion, because otherwise you are going to self-censor. And so this became over the decades a very powerful defense And basically, it enabled news outlets and journalists to do very proactive investigations and accountability journalism, whether it was looking into like the Vietnam War or Watergate, right up to now, and investigate some of the investigations into the president that would probably not have been able to happen absent those legal protections. And so it's not a coincidence that there is a movement on the right that is trying to either overturn the New York Times versus Sullivan case, or at least narrow it so that it applies to a smaller group of people. And it's unclear whether that will actually get the necessary votes on the Supreme Court to make it happen. But the simple fact that it is up for consideration and that at least two Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, have signaled their willingness to explore that, I think is a real sign of how much this debate has shifted just in the past several years.
So you raise a really interesting person in that last statement. Quite a lot of the book deals with Clarence Thomas. And he at one point said, we should protect our First Amendment coverage as much as possible. But this, of course, was before he was subject to the Anita Hill scandal.
Yeah.
And now he's been burned, or feels he's been burned. Do you feel that the press protections will no longer provide sufficient safeguard for journalists? Because you said in the book, you said plaintiffs don't need to win in court in order to be effective. And you actually cite a lot of bad examples in the book of good people telling the truth who go bust in the process.
Yeah. Yeah. And
they're right exactly, and they're broke.
Right. That is 100% a phenomenon that is happening all over the country right now. And look, I'm sitting right now in the newsroom of the New York Times. I've written for major news outlets for a while now. And the threat is not so much to people like me or institutions like the New York Times. The threat is much graver to smaller news outlets, local news, independent journalists. And look, this is one of the bright spots. The media industry is pretty screwed up financially. It has been for a while. One of the bright spots for me is this rise of independent journalists and local news outlets that are kind of using new business models to connect with readers and inform readers, sometimes on a very local level. And it's journalists like that who maybe have a Substack newsletter or a podcast or a YouTube channel that are uniquely vulnerable to these types of weaponized legal actions. And as you mentioned, and the book tells a lot of stories of journalists at a kind of micro level in some cases that are speaking up against like a real estate development in their town or investigating it or doing some writing about something that happens at like a town meeting. And a businessman or a company or a powerful local official files a lawsuit against them, knowing full well that the First Amendment basically is going to mean that their lawsuit gets tossed out of court. But sometimes it can take months or even years, that the legal bills are enormous. The amount of stress that people face is in some cases debilitating. And it has created already, even with these very robust legal protections that we have in place in this country, an enormous chilling effect on the ability of people that don't have a really powerful institution behind them, like I do, to just speak the truth and to do accountability journalism, even at a very local level. And I think that is, already really creating huge problems. And it's the type of thing that the First Amendment, at least in theory, is 100% designed to protect, and it's not.
It's interesting you mentioned about these alternative sources of news and commentary. One on Substack is Helen Cox Richardson, who's amazing. And yesterday she put, once you give up the idea that we are all equal before the law and have the right to due process, you've given up the whole game. You've admitted the principle that some people have more rights than others. And once you've replaced the principle of equality before the law with the idea that some people have no rights, you've granted your approval to the idea of authoritarian government. At this point, all you can do is hope that the dictator and his henchmen overlook you. I thought that was so chilling yesterday. So I'm going to go to Berna here. So Berna, you're a visiting fellow at Harvard. You teach political theory, originally from Spain. You wrote a very powerful op-ed piece, which I saw in The Guardian, saying you could never have imagined that writing a critical piece about the US government could put you at risk of deportation. Yet you cite in the piece the doctoral student from Tufts who was abducted a few blocks from where you live with no judicial warrant or need for probable cause. So you put, this represents a calculated strategy to silence dissent. Yet you were willing to take the risk and speak up. So why?
Well, thanks, Mary, and thanks so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with such great speakers. So I wrote this op-ed essentially because I felt that the cost of silence felt greater than the risk of speaking out. And perhaps to explain this, I can briefly describe what I've been saying on campus for the past weeks. I think that perhaps not all Americans are fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Like since the first news about ICE either deporting students or keeping them in detention centers or just rejecting them in the borders, I've seen a process in which different, not just international students, but mainly international students have started engaging in strategies of self-censorship. I think that these started when a French scholar was basically rejected in the border when he was attempting to enter the U.S. for a conference. I started seeing conversations among like colleagues from mainly European countries, but not just those, engaging in like just erasing all their WhatsApp conversations, of course, SMS, anything that could have traces or evidence of them being critical of the current administration. After Öztürk's arrest, and I think that this was because of not just the nature of the arrest, where, as you say, as far as I understand, and let me say that I'm not an expert on U.S. criminal law, but as far as I understand, the difference between ICE and a proper, let's say, arrest by a law enforcement agencies, that they do not have a criminal but civil arrest warrants, and for that reason they don't have like the same level of standard of probable cause. And for that very arbitrary nature of the arrest, I started seeing like different strategies that, like, for me, like in a way trigger all the red alarms. I saw friends that now take different routes when they walk to university and back home. They try not to follow the same route twice, and to change them as much as possible. This again is related to the sort of arrests that ICE can carry out, which must be like in public spaces. And this is just because of like participating in different protests, and mainly like pro-Palestinian protests in campus. But these are again scholars that are contributing to like different literatures. Like some of them are in fields that are not necessarily related to this, but they just felt at some point that they had to protest in favor of Palestine, and for that reason now we're seeing these sort of strategies. I also saw like different colleagues that published different like journalistic pieces. I can think of like two specific cases where they had been writing about the U.S. elections for European outlets, and not even American outlets. And again, these were not accusatory pieces in any way. It was just pure analysis from an almost academic point of view, but trying to, like, for instance, look into the different proposals that came to certain issues, and comparing like the different proposals that Trump and Kamala Harris had. And even with such low stake pieces, like I've been seeing people reaching out to these outlets and asking to raise any sort of trace that they might have had in publishing those articles, just out of pure fear that like that those could be taken out of context and weaponized against them. So it's been in this context. And just also another example that just came to mind. Lately, I've, as a reaction to this piece that you were just mentioning that I published, I've had people calling me on my cell, which, as you know, like it's not that usual, I would say, especially among like Gen Z people. And they do that because they don't want to like leave any traces, and they specify that when they call. Like, I don't want to, speak in any form of like written form that like it's registered. So again, seeing these kind of strategies that I think we associate more with either authoritarian or hybrid regimes, or people that work in very sensitive topics and in Western democracies. I think that for me was like the sort of like phenomena that triggered this alarm. I must say that I also felt, in a way, inspired by my topic of research. I am a sociologist, but I've been studying for 6 years now, intelligence oversight in the US and the UK. And of course, that being such a sensitive topic, I've sort of like, on the one hand, learned that genuine oversight and genuine accountability never does come from official institutions. They do come through the efforts of civil society, and especially investigative reporters and advocates that push for that. So I've had conversations with those that like really dare to not just face the administrations that have engaged in this kind of abuses, but even face their editors in trying to push for that. So I think that like, yeah, Mary,
You're
sorry.
raising interesting points here, lots of interesting points. One is the matter of surveillance. One of the people that was arrested, or not arrested, he wasn't permitted into the United States, was a German scientist who I think he got to Houston airport, opened his phone, and they took his phone, and apparently he had had texts critical of the Trump government, only because of the cuts to the science, and they wouldn't let him in. So my question is, we were talking earlier, David and myself, about what, sort of you can put in place as a journalist to protect, do you encrypt things? So how does somebody have surveillance on a German scientist coming to a medical conference? How did that come about?
Well,
Is everything being monitored?
yeah, I don't think that he was surveilled. Again, I'm not an expert on this specific. I'm not completely sure of what happened in this instance, but from what I've read, the sense I've sort of gotten about the situation was that when you're not a citizen and you attempt to cross the border, the U.S. border, a U.S. citizen can reject an inspection of their electronics if they're requested to. They will probably follow up on that, but they can still enter the country. As a non-citizen, we do have to at least accept a simple scan, which essentially involves a TSA or any sort of like law enforcement or security agent from the US checking your telephone and sort of like checking not just your conversations in different applications, but also checking your pictures. I've had friends that have gone through these and had like pretty uncomfortable situations due to these. And sometimes they can even request like an advanced scan, which requires copying every single like piece of information in your telephone to a device. So I'm not sure about what happened. I think that it was probably one of these scans that in some way led to them reading like these conversations and deciding that for that reason they couldn't be accepted into the country. But again, I'm not like an expert on this specific matter. And I'm not completely. I mean, I don't think that the details of this specific instance have been like in a way made available to the public domain. But just to like wrap up and respond like to your question, I almost felt I read this thing on Twitter like just while all this was happening, which was if you're wondering what you should be doing right now with everything that has been going on in the U.S., probably just ask yourself, what would have you wanted to do, or what would have you expected from a good German to do in the early 1930s? That's probably what you should be thinking about doing, and in a way, that's what pushed me to write this op-ed. I mean, I feel like if I didn't write that now, I would probably regret it like many years down the road. And of course, I'm in a more comfortable situation than some of my colleagues. Some of them have like still many years ahead of their research because they're like in the first years of their PhDs, or they're more like vulnerable to these attacks because of their nationality or their ethnicity. So I just simply felt I had to do that.
Okay, you raised another quick point about the fact that you're going back historically to the rise of fascism in Hitler, and how would people act in 1939 or just before, or between 33 and 39 when Hitler was in the ascendancy. So do you think that Americans might be a bit too complacent about what's going on? They're just not joining up the dots.
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I know that like we have to be careful with these analogies, right? I think that in 2016, I was probably in the camp that thought that calling Trump's policies and actions, comparing them to fascism, I always thought it was a bit exaggerated. I thought he was a reactionary, but there was something essentially different about between fascism and what that administration represented. I think that in big 2025, seeing what we've seen for the past 2 months, the kind of not just economic isolationism that the administration is pushing for, but the direct attack on civil society, the kind of blackmailing that the administration has attempted to do against the universities, the world of the arts, journalism, even law firms that are like hardly like part of civil society, but a key part of the public sector. These kind of actions, of course, trying to curtail freedom of expression, knowing that the First Amendment does not protect, or at least they claim does not protect in the same way, citizens and non-citizens. I think that all these make it very hard not to see concerning resemblances, right, between the ascension of fascism, not just in the German experience, but also in Italy, and of course, where I'm from in Spain. And I wouldn't say that Americans are necessarily more complacent than other Western citizens of like these democracies. But I think that, perhaps sometimes we can not be aware about like how fragile and how delicate these balances are, and how exceptional the world in which we've basically grown up is, right? Democracy is a historical exception. This is not the rule. Anyone that studies history knows that. And I think that sometimes we forget that the Weimar Republic had a constitution, Chile had a parliament. All these reactionary movements that have essentially finished with democracy and installed different forms of fascistic governance, most of them were actually cultivated within like democratic context. And I think that that's something that we have to be aware of. I think that Americans, on top of that, know that they live in what's probably like the oldest democracy in the world, and they have good reasons to feel comfortable about that. But again, I think that there's a risk that because the water is like the temperature of the water is rising in a very slowly but steady way, that we do
like
not
global
realize,
warming.
yeah, that this is happening till the water is boiling. And to be completely honest, Mary, just if I can add very quickly, I think that this is not just a matter about the public or public opinion. I think that there's also like a huge importance in the way in which politicians kind of give sense to the concerns that people have and articulate a sort of response to what's going on. And I think that a mistake that some politicians have made in Europe was just to pose these reactionary parties by saying, well, they're reactionary, they're anti-democratic. Democracy is extremely important, but I think that everyone sort of believes that they are for democracy and for different versions of democracy. We have to be aware that liberal democracy is not the only one, right? So it is, I think, extremely important for, in this case, the American Democratic Party to propose like an alternative that is appealing to the people, right? It's not enough to say that Americans sometimes are complacent. I think they need to find a way to articulate this response, and it cannot just be based on saying that Trump is fascistic, Trump is reactionary. They need to get excited by an alternative agenda, and that's what I hope.
Sorry to cut you off, Berna, but I've got a few other points we've got to hit, and we got halfway through already. So we've gone from activism to academics. Now, unlike Columbia, Princeton isn't bending to the federal government coercion. And its president said, we have the willing to speak up, as you said, willing to say no to funding if it's going to constrain our ability to pursue the truth. Harvard has joined the fight, saying it won't surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. So do you think the courts are up to the task? So far, Trump seems to have got away with ignoring the law pretty well. David, what do you think?
I don't know is the short answer. That's a cop-out, but I don't know. I mean, I think I feel like every day for the past couple of weeks, we have seen the Trump administration pushing things a little bit further. And I think that is just strange for me as someone who has spent I'm American. I was born here, raised here, educated here, lived most of my life here. These are questions that most Americans are not accustomed to asking of ourselves, and I think are a little bit ill-equipped to ask of ourselves because we don't know an alternative. And it's inconceivable to me that a presidential administration in this country would not adhere to what the Supreme Court says or what even a lower court says. And yet here we are. So I don't know. I am paid to be objective and neutral. And yet I feel very comfortable saying that I hope it doesn't get to that point. But I fear that it might.
Okay, let's bring Jesse into the conversation. You're an educator, an activist. You're author of a book, Teach Truth. And yesterday you wrote a very compelling opinion piece which said Trump's assault on education isn't a distraction. It's the strategy, the leading edge of enforcing fascism today. Fascism is sustained not only by violence, but also by the suppression of the truth and control of knowledge. Trump's truth crime laws, you call them, are policies that punish honest teaching about race, gender, and history, and they're foundational to his authoritarian strategy. So, wow, you said a lot in that piece yesterday. How is this affecting you? What are you seeing as an educator? Are you seeing people changing their curriculum, books disappearing?
All of that. Yeah, thank you, Mary. I work a lot with educators all over the country who are trying to continue to teach about Black history under very challenging circumstances. They have coded everything that relates to Black history as critical race theory and demonized it as indoctrination. But in fact, what they're really doing is criminalizing the teaching of Black history, of anything about gender or sexuality or anything about race. And I really think that Elon Musk's salute at Trump's inauguration wasn't just fascist pageantry. It was really a policy statement about their agenda for education in this society. And when I talk about truth crime laws, we should look at how education policy has shifted from since the first Trump administration until today. When I talk about truth crime laws, it's not to use hyperbolic language. It's to accurately describe the types of policies that are being implemented across the country. So let's take Florida, for example. In Florida, the official state curriculum today reads that slavery was of, quote, personal benefit to Black people, right? In Florida, if you get caught with a book that is on the banned list, a book about race or gender or sexuality, it carries with it a felony charge. We're talking about a 5-year jail sentence and a $5,000 fine for teaching kids about racism, for saying that systemic racism was foundational to the United States, right? That is what many states across the country have banned. And my ancestors were enslaved in this country. They were enslaved on plantations in Mississippi and in Louisiana. That's a truth. And they want to ban the ability of us to talk about the fact that slavery was systemically racist, right? Folks should know that this isn't just Florida. As draconian as Florida's laws are, today in the United States, it's almost half of all students go to a school where their teacher is mandated to lie to them about Black history, about systemic racism, right? So we're talking about, this is before Trump's policy of defunding schools goes into effect, right? So he recently signed an executive order that says any school caught teaching about systemic racism will have their schools defunded, right? You cannot teach the history of this country without teaching about systemic racism. Slavery was systemic racism. Our nation was built, the economy of this country was built off the backs of my ancestors who did that work for free, who were tortured and beaten for that work, and so many thousands of other African American people. That is part of our history, and they don't want us to face that history and learn from that history because they want to repeat that history. And I'll say that as draconian as Trump's policies are, um, and he is rapidly borrowing from playbooks of fascist regimes that try to erase knowledge. Uh, it isn't wholly unique, though, in U.S. history. We should be aware that it was illegal for my ancestors to read and write, right? And it was punishable by death, by maiming. People lost fingers and were beaten severely for being caught reading and writing. And, that the first anti-literacy law in this country was passed in 1740 in South Carolina as a response to the Stono Rebellion, when a man named Jemmy led an uprising of enslaved Black people. And he marched with a banner that said liberty, going from plantation to plantation, collecting enslaved people and leading a revolt. They not only wanted to kill all of the enslaved people in revolt, but they wanted to kill the ability of Black people to ever write that word liberty again, right? And that's why during Reconstruction, after the Civil War, Black people built this public school system in this country. It did not exist beforehand. There were common schools in the North that were nominally public, except for many of them, most of them excluded Black children from the school. So how public can we call that? In the South, there were no public schools. So formerly enslaved Black people built the public school system in this country, and the Ku Klux Klan burnt down over 600 Black schools during Reconstruction, right? So what we're seeing today of these truth crime laws is a continuation of a very nasty authoritarian and fascistic legacy of anti-Black education in this country.
Can I just jump in? You also, in that article yesterday, you quoted from Jason Stanley's book. Now, Jason Stanley, people might have been following him, is a Yale professor who is fleeing, he says, to Canada as a result of Colombia caving in to Trump's, conditions. And you talk about his book, which is called Erasing History, in which you say Trump's education agenda is doing exactly what fascist regimes have always done, narrowing curriculum to a single state-approved version of history, one where submission is called freedom and dissent is called extremism. So how do you counter this with rewriting or rewriting this white history?
Yeah, no, that's what's happening today. That's what we're seeing. Universities being threatened with being defunded if they don't stop students from protesting, from exercising their First Amendment. And teachers are being surveilled and silenced. A teacher in Florida just last week was fired for calling a student by the name that they wanted to be called by, right? Because of this transphobic hysteria in this country. Children who want to use a different name now can lead to teachers being fired. The Washington Post ran an article in 2022 that showed 160 educators in this country had been fired or pushed out of the classroom for educating about race, gender, or sexuality. That number is certainly much higher today as we see this crackdown intensifying on educators. And so it is vital that we build collective resistance to this neo-McCarthyism that we're seeing today. And in order to build the resistance to this neo-McCarthyism, we have to understand what McCarthyism was and what the playbook that they're drawing from is. And I'll just say briefly that, during the Red Scare, thousands of educators across the country were fired, including over 400 educators in New York City alone. under suspicion of being a communist. But really, any teacher that questioned inequality, that allowed students to consider inequality in a country that had Jim Crow segregation, right? If you allowed kids to consider racism or inequality, you were labeled a communist and fired. And as vicious as the Red Scare was, the Lavender Scare was even more vicious by some measures, right? So in fact, more employees of the federal government were fired in the late 40s and early 50s, having been labeled homosexual, then were fired for being labeled a communist. And in Florida, again, not to surprise you, but in Florida, they had the Johns Committee that was first established to root out communists and then quickly turned to investigate every single female teacher under suspicion of being a lesbian, right? And they fired hundreds of them. And though that is what the don't say gay, don't say trans laws that we're seeing today is drawn from that authoritarian playbook. And so I'll end by saying, what was it that defeated McCarthyism? How did we finally end an era when all someone had to do was whisper that you were gay, you were LGBTQ plus, or you were a communist, and then you were thrown onto a list and disappeared, fired, right? What was it that finally ended that? It wasn't any brilliant politician. In my estimation, it wasn't any powerful person or any billionaire or anyone with influence. It was the masses of people who joined in the civil rights movement, who finally lost their fear of going to jail and did the sit-ins and said, I don't care if you call me a communist anymore, I'm fighting for my freedom. And I think it will take nothing short of that today to curb these rising fascist policies of a new collective upsurge of social movements.
Right. I think what you're saying is, and you've already actually proven it, is that you might have to be willing to be arrested. You were pepper sprayed in a peaceful Martin Luther King march.
Yes.
So, and you know, that's really what, and then you took the city of Seattle to court and won. So you just have to be dogged, I guess, in your approach. Anyway, let's go back for one moment, because we haven't got a lot of time left, to the definition of truth, because that's what this program was predicated upon. All these things speak to truth, either journalism or academia, the right to protest. They're all talking about speaking your truth, and history is included in that. So first off, we do have a great shrinkage of press ownership now in this country. We've got thousands of indie publications have gone under, or else they've merged. And now we've got 6 large conglomerates that control 90% of our information. So is it going to become harder and harder, start with you, David, for people to ascertain what is true anymore and what is a trustworthy source? If we don't know who or what is owning something, unless we research it, and why they would say something.
Yeah, probably. I guess I would frame the stakes and the situation a little bit differently, which is that there's been a long deterioration in trust in traditional sources of information, namely the mainstream media, and that has been replaced by, and I think the trend has been exacerbated by, the rise in things like social media. And so it's entirely possible for two people living in the same community with a lot of the same shared interests, whether it's schools or sports teams or having good, well-paved infrastructure, to live in completely different information ecosystems, and to be reading from different, or speaking and understanding the world from completely radically different viewpoints. And I think that is, obviously really problematic and dangerous to me. And maybe this is like self-serving because I work for a big media company. But to me, the concentration and ownership isn't really the issue at this point. It's more that there is a really systematic effort by, in particular on the right, but in some cases on the left as well, I think, to diminish and undercut information and sources of information that do not reinforce people's own existing belief systems. And Again, I think that's something that has been enabled and exacerbated in large part by social media. But I think it's also that we live in really polarized times, and people, given the choice between reading things and encountering information and trying to understand other people's point of view and listening with empathy and really trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand why they feel a certain way about a certain topic. Instead, it's much simpler, easier, cheaper, more comforting, and it probably in some like weird psychological way, like more invigorating to just have your views constantly reinforced. And I think there's, to me, one of the alarming things about this trend is that historically, one of the things that I think has made America great is that the First Amendment protects everyone's right to speak freely, including and especially, in fact, the people with whom you disagree most vehemently. And I think it's incumbent upon people, and this is a right, by the way, that protects people regardless of your political views, ideology, class, race, background, or at least it should. And I think it's really incumbent upon everyone here. And I gather that most of the people listening to this right now are probably left of center, but I think it's incumbent upon everyone to not view this in terms of ideology or politics, but to view this as a basic question of what America stands for. And one of the things we stand for is the right to speak freely, and the First Amendment is first for a reason. And I think we need to really kind of get back in the habit of not thinking about this as an issue where we want to protect voices we agree with. It's about protecting all voices, regardless of whether you disagree with them or not.
Well, not to go back and blame, but I think part of that problem, that whole divisiveness, which everyone is desperately trying to understand, the psychology of the class system now in America, I think it was deliberately forced and engineered by Trump, because you were either with him or you were against him. You weren't the other party, you were against him. So it became a confrontational battle every time he made a statement. And so that has drawn enormous division between people. And now they're sitting in these camps. I'm not saying they can't get out of them and talk, but I think it's harder. And particularly when Jeff Bezos said that he didn't need to have a lot of discussion politically in the Washington Post because people got that online. Wow, I don't think that.
I mean, I definitely agree
hope.
that Trump is like been a great destroyer of the concept of truth in this country. And there's no question about that. And it's not like an accident. It's by design, because he has regularly promoted an agenda predicated on lies and distortions and conspiracy theories. But I think there's a lot of blame to go around it. Frankly, I think the mainstream media itself deserves some of the blame for this. I don't think we have been nearly good enough at holding ourselves accountable, being transparent about when we make big mistakes, like because our biases lead us to come down too hard or too soft on someone, or maybe to miss a line of coverage, or maybe go big on a line of coverage that we shouldn't. And I think there are a lot of examples of that. I'm not talking about the Times in particular, but in general in the media. But I mean, look, there's no question that this is a crucial, central, pioneering part of the Trump agenda. And it's one of the things he has executed best over the past whatever it is, 9 years now. He has managed to sow great distrust in many of our institutions, including the media.
But also, I can't work out why the press haven't come up with a really good strategy, because I heard Steve Bannon years ago saying that the strategy they were going to use when he came back in, Trump, was they were going to deluge the press every single day with 3 or 4 stories, scattering their attention so that they couldn't concentrate on more than one thing. And so that's exactly what Trump does. Today,
well,
he's
what are we supposed to do, though? Like today, should we cover tariffs, deportations, or the assault on universities?
I think you've got to step up your game. You know what I mean?
Maybe.
You know, or call him on it and say this is a deliberate strategy to keep the public confused. You know, Greenland, building a hotel in Gaza, getting rid of the immigrants on the border. I mean, and buying the Panama Canal. It's like, it's like a game show. So I think you have to come in hard and say, this is a game show. Let's concentrate on what's important here.
I would submit that if you were, I don't actually know what you would see if you looked at the New York Times homepage right now, but I would guess. No, I know, and I'm not trying to be defensive, but I think it's a little more complicated. I think there's an easy critique of the media here, which is that we're not doing a good enough job of holding people like Trump to account. And I think the truth is, I agree. I'm sure you're right in some cases. I think by and large, like, first of all, this is hard. Second of all, we're human and make mistakes. Third of all, a great deal of the information that circulates in all platforms that exposes bad things done by powerful people like Trump is the result of dogged reporting by the mainstream
No, I
media.
understand that.
And I think it's like, it's very easy in hindsight to say, well, the Greenland is a distraction, Panama Canal is a distraction. Well, like, what if we invade Greenland? Like, what if we invade Panama? I'm not saying I'm predicting that, and I'm not, but it's like in the moment when you are like, you're listening to the president of the United States make official proclamations and send delegations of senior American officials to countries like that. I don't think ignoring it is the right option. I acknowledge
I
fully
don't.
we don't always do it
David, you
perfectly.
can't ignore it. I think what you have to do is call it for what it is. This is a game show host that is throwing stuff out to get the audience, like seals being fed fish. And I think people just have to be aware that they're being duped. They're just being taken for a ride. And I think if people become more media savvy, they'll be a bit more skeptical about how they view information. Is it factual? Is it rubbish? I don't know how you do that quickly. I think one way is to teach media education and savviness in school, which I'm sure won't be top of Trump's agenda. But anyway, I think you've all done a great job of, in your own way, sort of actively opposing the new normal by writing, speaking up, you taking part in a protest in Seattle, Jesse. Somebody has written in here, how can we, the rational portion of the citizenry, stand in opposition to this idiocy? Trump's attacks on DEI, immigration, etc. Any suggestions before we have to close?
Can I just give a one sentence answer to that?
Yeah.
I have a suggestion, which is subscribe to news organizations. I don't care if it's the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, or it's a local person, a local newspaper in your town, or someone who's doing a Substack that you find interesting. Good information costs money to obtain and to produce, and you are going to get what you pay for. So that's one first step. Make those business models work.
Very good advice there. Anybody else going to suggest?
I'll jump in and say that we got to get active. As I said, it was a civil rights movement that ultimately broke through the hysteria and paranoia of McCarthyism. And so we need to build collective struggle again. And on June 7th, we have the National Teach Truth Day of Action. You can go to the Zinn Education Project and get all the information you need to hold an event where you can research your own community, learn the history of your neighborhood, of your school, of your area that they are suppressing, and teach it to your community. Instead of a normal march and rally, have a historical walking tour where you teach the truth that they are trying to suppress, and then link up with people across this country who are wanting to build this kind of mass collective struggle that's necessary to stand up to these attacks by Trump and that are frankly being enabled by so many in the Democratic Party who aren't building the resistance that's needed, right? I mean, if they sponsored the Teach Truth Day of Action, the Democratic Party could flood the streets with millions of people who are against book bans, who are against curriculum bans, and he would not be able to get away with that agenda. And yet they're quiet. And it's the five of us at the Zinn Education Project organizing this National Day of Action, right? So we have to, I think, hold all the politicians to account and put forward a better vision for what education could be in this country.
Okay, last word from Berna.
Yeah, it will be short. I would say the one priority should be to limit the power that corporate organizations have in US politics. That's the one exceptional thing about this country in comparative terms with, let's say, Western Europe. But to do that, like, I completely agree with what Jesse was just saying. I think that there's a need to build collective politics, mass participation. But I think that that can only be achieved through a positive message. So it's not enough to say we have to resist. we have to offer, or well, the Democratic Party has to find something interesting and appealing, especially to young voters, that can mobilize them. And I think that there's going to be a process of soul searching within the the Democratic Party, and I just hope that the one faction that gets people excited wins. That's I think my 2 cents.
Okay, well, or your 2 pesetas or euros. Okay, right.
My 2 euros, yeah.
We covered a lot of ground. I hope we enlightened some people and inspired some people. No, it wasn't all depressive news. That was not the object of the exercise. So I'd like to thank David Enrich. I've got your name right. Is it Enrich?
Enrich is my
Enrich.
preferred pronunciation, but it's okay. Everyone gets it a little bit wrong.
Okay. Berna León and Jesse Hagopian for the valuable presence here today, and also your noble work in standing up for truth and justice, all of you. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you soon.